Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was not supposed to be out on that trail. I knew that the whole week before work was a mess. My roommate had asked me to cover a shift, and my phone was half dead, but I told myself I needed fresh air more than I needed anything else. My friend Jess was the one who finally twisted my arm. One night, 2 days, no people, she said, like it was a package. We picked a small loop in the Appalachians, nothing famous, just a stretch that wound through ridges and old growth. It was late October, leaves were already turning, and the air had that cold on the inside feel that makes you pull your jacket closer without realizing it. We got there early so the parking lot would be empty. It was the kind with a wooden kiosk and the usual laminated signs about ticks and erosion and stay on the trail. Jess made coffee on a tiny stove in the back of her car and handed me a paper map as if we'd be the sort of people who needed paper maps. I folded it twice and put it in my pack. The map looked like every other park map, squiggly lines for trails, blue for streams, little tents where the campgrounds were. Someone had scrawled in pen by the lower right corner, "Cell service not reliable beyond this point." I laughed and shoved it in my pocket. The beginning of the trail was the easy part. Families were doing short loops, a couple with a golden retriever waved, and we passed a pair of older hikers who were moving so slow it looked like they were in conversation with every rock. The trail got quieter as we climbed. The trees knit together and made a green ceiling. We were talking about nothing important, a messy breakup of a coworker, how Jess's new boots were rubbing, and the sky turned a flat, pale gray. We saw him before he spoke. He was standing where the marked trail forked, half in shadow, with his hands folded in front of him. He wore what looked like a park ranger uniform, olive green shirt, a patch on the shoulder, a white-brimmed hat. The shirt was too tidy for this place. It had that pressed look, as if it had been ironed that morning. He had a pack slung low and boots that were scuffed but clean. He wasn't the first park employee we'd seen on hikes before, and we both nodded the automatic nod hikers do. "Morning," he said, smiling the kind of smile that stops just short of teeth. His voice was normal, no twang. He said his stuff in quick, clipped sentences like he'd done this dozens of times. "Trail ahead closed. Bear activity. You'll want to come with me, detours safer. Bear activity." In late October that sounded plausible. Bears get a little bolder when they're fattening up. Jess asked, "Closed? Which section?" He pointed. We could see the official trail arrow, but the path curved away and into a narrower corridor. "Between the old sugar maples and the creek," he said. "There was a sow with 2 cubs the other day. We're rerouting foot traffic. Come this way, I'll take you round." He said it the way someone offered directions to the bathroom. Casual, sure, like the world was working exactly the way he said. I remember thinking how calm he seemed. He didn't speak like someone who was on an emergency job. But then the patch on his shoulder, I looked up at it, out of habit, didn't have the park name. It had a generic emblem, like a store-bought patch. The metal badge on his chest was shiny, almost new. He hadn't asked us where we were headed, he assumed we wanted his help. That was small and odd, but not a red flag by itself. Jess glanced at me and said, "Should we show ID?" "Just to make sure." He laughed then, too fast. "No need. I'm on duty." He tightened the straps of his pack. "I'll just lead you through. It's not far." His eyes flicked to my map in my hand. I felt, stupidly, like a fish that hadn't realized a net was coming until after it was on its head. We followed. The detour started as a well-worn path, like a game trail people sometimes used when the weather had messed with the official way. At first it was still part of the park, the soil compacted, small bits of flagging tape on branches. The trees leaned in closer and the light got thinner. That sinking quiet you feel when the world narrows happened, a silence that wasn't the absence of noise but the presence of something else. A robin somewhere tried twice to sing, then stopped. The man talked as we walked. He told us not to worry about the official markers, that those were sometimes slow to update, that rangers like him kept things moving. He told stories about a real bruiser last season, about the time a bear opened a car. He used names of places I recognized, but he said them like someone saying a list he'd memorized. Every now and then he would glance at us like he was checking the batteries in a flashlight, quick, clinical looks that made my shoulders seat into their place. We asked for identification again. This time I said it with my hand out. "Can we see a badge? Just so we're sure." His face changed. It wasn't anger exactly, more like a smudge of irritation that didn't suit the smile. He told us he'd left his wallet at the station. He said the station was a half hour back the way we come, and he mentioned a name, Deputy Harlan, like it existed somewhere real. He offered, in compensation, a little laminated card with a photo stapled to it. The photo was mostly Clint in shadow, but the name under it had a first name and then volunteer. I wanted to ask why a volunteer would be routing hikers away from an active bear area, but the thought hitchhiked on the thought of the bear itself and died. The trail forked again and the path the man took got rougher. The official blazes thinned out, then disappeared. Dead leaves muffled our steps. I noticed then that the detour was going away from the marked campground instead of around it. Jess frowned and said so. The man smiled and said, "We get the erosion if everyone goes the same way. This'll put you on a lesser used track, more private, you know?" He used "we" a lot. He said "we" as if he and the park and the trees were in league. He said "we" even about the cubs, like he was in a small group that watched everything. He wasn't alone in saying it. People fall into that when they feel small in front of the wild, but it kept making me look at his hands. They were clean. No salt or grime under the nails, as if he didn't do the work he claimed. His belt had neither radio nor multi-tool. He moved easily, like he'd walked this path before, and when he glanced back he held that soft, appraising look. A little after noon the weather changed. It wasn't rain at first, it was the kind of damp that seeped through wool and made it feel heavier. The clouds dropped and the light flattened. We stopped to check our map. Jess unfolded in our rock and the man hovered as if privacy was something fragile he didn't want to break. "How far to the creek?" Jess asked. The map saying an hour. Her voice sounded small. He told us a different time. About 20 minutes. He tapped the map like he knew it better than we did and then, almost offhand, said, "You don't need to be afraid of me. I'm trying to keep you safe." That line got stuck in my head. I remember staring at him and thinking how easy it was to use safety as a lever. I remember wishing I'd asked more, or not smiled when he talked. It's ridiculous how retrospect turns simple acts into wisdom. 100 yards later the path narrowed to little more than 2 parallel divots. The trees were older here, roots like exposed ribs. We came out of a stand of birch into a small clearing. There was a shallow, muddy stream crossing with a fallen log for a bridge. The man stopped, and I stopped behind him. He said, "I'll just scout ahead and make sure the alternative is clear. You two wait here." He sounded like he was saying something polite, the sort of thing a stranger might say before stepping aside. He walked away and didn't look back to make sure we'd stay. His pace was loose. He held his shoulders like someone on a beach, not like someone on official business. We waited. The silence grew a weight. I heard a beetle grinding against a leaf. I heard the distant slam of an old branch being struck by wind, and it sounded like someone closing a door very slowly. Jess's breathing got shallow. She chewed the inside of her cheek. I pulled the map back out, not because I trusted it, but because I needed to feel the lines under my fingers. When the man didn't come back for longer than felt natural, I told myself he was just being thorough. Then the twig snapped. It was small, a delicate little crack like the sound of paper being folded too quickly. Not far off, maybe 30 yards, as if someone was stepping through leaves. I turned and saw movement between the trees, a pair of legs in olive trousers, the boots moving carefully. The man was walking back toward us, but he wasn't alone. There was a figure following him, moving like a ghost on a weeded path. At first I thought it was just another hiker, someone with a pack and a hat. Then I saw the way his head tilted, like he was watching us more than the trail. His shirt wasn't as neat as the ranger's, and it had a dark shape on the back that could have been a logo or a stain. He kept a few steps behind the man, matching his stride. The man caught sight of us, and the smile came back, quick as a switch. "Good," he said. "Good you waited." He pointed to the second guy and introduced him as my partner, Tom. He gestured like they were unpaid actors in a safety presentation. Tom gave us a nod that didn't reach his eyes. He had a scar on one knuckle that made his wave look like a small, careful motion. He smelled like someone who had just come in from a fire, not smoke exactly, but that dry, dusty scent of a summer of sweat. He didn't speak much. He walked a little behind the ranger as if he'd been told to. The dynamics were off. They read like a play where two people had rehearsed who would say what. We kept following. The path lost any pretense of being a park thoroughfare. There were no more flags. The underbrush closed and sometimes reached out a hand to snag at our sleeves. The man walked like he knew where he was going. The quiet behind him folded in on itself. I had this sensation then, like being in a movie where the camera slows down on the bad part, everything gets a little sharper and everybody's motions get a fraction off beat. We'd been walking maybe 40 minutes when Jess whispered, "This doesn't look right." "I thought it was supposed to put us back near the creek," I answered. My voice felt too loud. He stopped abruptly then, mid-stride, like someone who hadn't expected to be questioned. He crouched and pointed at the ground with a finger. "Bear tracks," he said. He leaned close and traced tiny indentations in the mud. They were there, yes, small rounded prints like a bear's, although they were too faint to be convincing. He leaned back and rubbed his hands together. "Right. That way." He pointed in a direction that made us yet again move away from anything that looked like the map. We kept walking. The feeling that someone had drawn a circle around us and was tightening where necessary got heavier. The man started telling us things he shouldn't have known as if to prove legitimacy. How many bears had been seen in the county last winter, the ranger post's phone number, an old story about a hunter who lost his dog on the ridge. He said these facts like ammunition. Jess asked him, again, where his badge was. "I really think we should see official ID," she said. The man smiled, then made a small, impatient sound and reached into his pack. He pulled out a laminated card this time that had a name and a photo, but the card looked like the kind of thing you print at home, a glossy sheet, laminate slightly peeling at the corner. Under the photo, someone had handwritten volunteer in thick marker. He slid it at us like an old deck of cards. The photo body didn't match the man standing in front of us, different hairline, different face shape. The name did not sound like any ranger name I'd seen on signs. I felt like a child catching a parent in an obvious lie. "Look, I'm trying to help," he said. His voice was the least calm I've ever heard. "We have to keep hikers away from the creek. Dangerous." "Why are you sending us away from the marked trails?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He scanned us as if deciding which of our faces to believe. His jaw tightened. His knuckles were white. He moved faster, a small shove of hurry in his steps, and every time he moved faster I felt the space between myself and safety shrink. He was trying to put distance between us and the trailhead. He kept glancing back to see if we'd follow, like a shepherd checking his flock. We slowed down. I remember that more clearly than anything else, the decision to not let him dictate our pace. I had the map in my hand and I fumbled for it, spread it out against a rock. My fingers puckered at the creases. I pointed at the loop and said, "This shows the creek right there. We're supposed to be on the outer loop, right where the campground is." He leaned over, closer than necessary. I felt his breath like a small, warm wind on my ear. "Maps are old," he said. "They print them every year, but the land moves faster." I laughed that laugh you use when you want to be brave but feel absurd. "Do you have a ranger radio or something?" I asked. "Can you call the station?" He actually seemed offended. "No, I handle it myself," he said. "We don't want traffic near the cubs. People spook them." He snapped the card back into his pocket as if it had been a formality he'd indulged us with. "Come on. We'll just take a shortcut." Jess and I looked at each other. The real world was not supposed to be a place where strangers who claimed authority refused to produce ID. It was, though. I remember the tiny, animal panic that rises when rules fall away, the mounting detail that makes you aware you've missed something, like in a dream where you notice you're walking into a house you used to know, and it's been altered just a little. Branches started to scratch at us. The man kept choosing angles that meant we traveled under boughs that made the light darker. Once, he reached out and took my shoulder in a small, disarming drag to get me moving. I remember the shape of his hand, fingers long, thumbs like clamps, and the fact he didn't let go when I almost stumbled. He wasn't smiling then, his face was plain. "Sorry about that," he said, and the way he said it made my skin prickle. When we came to a small embankment, he stopped and looked like he thought of something. "There's a service road near here," he said. "We can cut across. It's better than climbing that ridge." "Are we allowed on a service road?" Jess said. She didn't sound confident. He shrugged. "I have clearance. It's not a problem." He turned his head in a quick, sharp movement, like someone checking for witnesses, then walked down the embankment toward what we'd assumed was the service road. It wasn't a road so much as an old four-wheeler track someone had used to haul wood. It vanished in a tangle of green. We followed him. The underbrush closed in. I had to push branches away. The man moved like a predatory animal in a cage, deliberate, economical. The sky began to rain steadily. The leaves hissed when water hit them. The sound of rain made everything more intimate. Water ran in small rivulets into the dirt path and left a thin line of brown in the leaves. My boots started to slurp. The detour was lengthening into something else, an offshoot not on any map. I'd noticed that our compass app on my phone had started to drift. The battery icon winked low. My pockets felt like they had nothing in them that could save us. At one point the man turned to us and his voice softened. "Listen," he said, lowering his head like he was about to share something confidential. I felt stupid then, because every horror movie had taught me to not let the stranger lower his voice. He said, "We had someone here a couple weeks ago. Couple got lost. She was on a loop, not paying attention. Name was Sam. Sam Harper." He said the name slowly, like a teacher pronouncing a spelling word. "We couldn't find her immediately. Found pieces." My mouth went dry. "Pieces?" I echoed. He shrugged like it was not a big deal. "Clothes, map. This area, it's rough. People lose stuff." He bent down and poked at a tuft of grass like he was checking a bug. "We had to call in a unit." I think that's when something in my chest turned. Up until then I had allowed myself to believe he was a misguided volunteer. Saying another person's name like that, though, and saying we found pieces like it was no more than a lost sock, made the world in front of us tilt. "Do you know where Sam was headed?" Jess asked. Her voice was thin. He hummed and said, "Supposed to be the ridge, I think." His eyes darted to the tree line and back at us. "Ah." She had a map. Thought she could cut across. It happens. People want shortcuts. Did she make it back? I asked, hearing the panic in my own voice. It sounded foreign. He hesitated and finally said, "We never found her body. But maps were shredded. Her name was on one of them." The rain fell harder then, and for a moment there was only the sound of water, and my own heart like a small, frantic bird. The man tucked his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling into the fabric like claws. "I don't like to talk about it," he said. "It upsets people. We had to make a choice. The easy solution, follow him, let him lead, felt wrong. But the alternative, go back exactly the way we come, felt dangerous too, because by now, if he had intended something, he knew we were suspicious. I think the only reason we made the decision we did was because both of us had small, stubborn survival instincts. Don't make a scene, don't raise voices, don't accuse without proof, and move, always move." We kept walking. The rain turned the colors of the leaves to a wet, dark sheen. The man began to pick up speed. He started taking corners with an energy that had a purpose to it. He walked like someone trying to get us somewhere far from other people. When we asked him again for his credentials, he reached toward his pocket, and this time his hand closed around something, a knife, maybe, or a keyring, and he shoved it back like it was annoying. He lowered his voice and said, "The park's been short-handed. People have to do more than their share. I don't need you checking me." That was the moment he stopped trying to be helpful. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't pleasant. He had a hard edge to him, a distance that wasn't there before. He started to hurry us along, and as he did, a second figure, Tom, fell further behind and then rejoined the man, his movement measured. They moved in that small tandem that looked choreographed. We rounded a bend and the man suddenly stopped and turned like he had a plan. "Wait here. I'll just go ahead and make sure the trail is clear." He didn't wait long this time. He stood a few feet away, and when he turned his back he moved as if preoccupied. I don't remember deciding, but Jess and I ducked behind a thicket. Our hearts were pounding loud enough that I could hear them echo like far-off drums. The man walked to the edge of a clearing and then vanished into the trees. Tom followed him, but the second the pair disappeared, something in me snapped. We ran. Not sprinted, ran like two people who could count their breaths and wanted to use the power of steady lungs. We jogged for a minute, then broke into a full run when the trail opened up. We didn't know where we were going except away from them. Branches laced across our faces. Rain slapped my neck. We ran until my thighs burned and my lungs felt like they were made of stone. After what felt like an hour but probably wasn't more than 20 minutes, we came out on a narrow but official trail. The blazes were bright white on the trees, like a language we finally understood. There was a sound then, a human voice in the distance, calling someone's name, ordinary and clear. We followed it, and it led us downhill until the trail opened into a small, used parking area. There were 2 other cars and a maintenance truck. A woman in a yellow jacket looked up as we came into the lot, wide-eyed. "You two okay?" she asked. My voice was raw, and my words came out in a tangle. "That man," I started, and Jess filled in the rest. She said the word ranger like a question, like the sound made by something unlikely. The woman put down her thermos, took out a radio, and said into it calmly, "Dispatch, we have 2 hikers in Lot B, possible unauthorized person on trail. Can you confirm any closure? We told them everything in a clots and bits manner. The man, the volunteer card, the detour, Tom, the talk about Sam. The woman listened and wrote things down on a thin pad. She walked us to the maintenance office and offered us hot coffee. Her hands were steady. She called the park office and then the sheriff's department. There were other people around, a family pulling on rain jackets, 2 men cleaning their boots, and the presence of others made the world narrower in the right way. Normal people, doing normal things. The deputy who arrived had an actual badge and a real radio. We told the story again in cleaner sentences and he asked the obvious questions. Did the man have ID? Did he have anything else? Did he threaten you? We said yes and no and then yes again. He called for a unit to do a sweep. He said things like, we'll look into it and we'll take a report. He looked at Jess and me like he was trying to test the truth of what we said against a map of his own experience. He handed us a damp paper towel and told us to wait. I thought that would be it. I thought the police would go into the woods in pairs with radios and flashlights and that the world would rearrange into safety, like a blanket thrown over a chair. It didn't happen that quickly. The forest is big and patient. After an hour, the deputy returned and asked if we wanted to go with them to look for any sign of the man. We wanted this, of course. We wanted a closure that could be spoken about in tally lines and checkboxes. We followed. The woods felt different at that pace. The leaves had the tiredness of rain. The deputy led us down a different route toward the area we'd last seen the man. I held the map in my hand, and it felt like an anchor. We were moving slow and careful when the deputy stopped and pointed. A few yards off the trail, buried among damp leaves and moss, was a ragged piece of paper. It had been shredded roughly and jammed under a root, like someone had tried to hide it. We knelt. The deputy put on gloves and picked up the fragments. They were wet and crumpled and the ink had bled in places, but someone had written a name in thick black marker on one corner. It was only 4 letters, Sam. We didn't need to read the rest. The name made a cold slide through the chest. The deputy called for another unit and took photos. He said, this could be from the same person who went missing a few weeks back, and his voice had the kind of low cadence that announces things you can't unknow. They found other things too as they searched with flashlights and K9 units over the next 2 days. A torn piece of jacket, a shoelace cut clean, a pile of what looked like someone had tried to burn paper. Nothing like the end of a movie, nothing neat. But they found enough to tell a story that made everyone's hair stand up, signs that someone had been here, someone who had altered maps and brushed away obvious trail markers, small things meant to confuse and redirect. I slept badly that night in a motel off the highway. I kept thinking of the man's hands and that soft smile and how easily he folded the truth into something that felt necessary. I replayed every small choice, every time I'd step forward instead of walking away. Jess and I both checked our phones, which had found service somewhere near the highway, and we watched the small bubble of news and the deputy's texts fill up our screens. They told us more people had reported an unauthorized individual and that units had found more shredded maps near the old logging road. We gave statements. People took our pictures, our boots, our gloves, even the laminate card the man had shown us. The sheriff's office asked us questions we didn't expect. Did he say anything about an ex? Did he mention a partner? Did he look like he knew the woods? We answered honestly, because there was no point in faking. They said they couldn't rule anything out. Later, the deputy told us they'd found other maps, and on one of them, not the one in the underbrush but another found near a different trailhead, someone had written in marker the name of a person who'd been reported overdue over a month ago. The writing wasn't neat. It looked like someone had scrawled names on maps as a habit. I remember the deputy's fingers pressed together when he said it, like the motion creates a little shelter for the thought. There was an arrest eventually. Not immediate, Not in that first fog of fear, but days later. They pulled a man out from a cabin near an old logging road. He wore clothes similar to the ones we'd seen. His uniform pieces were in a neat pile in a closet, as if they'd been cleaned. There was a small collection of printed volunteer badges, all laminated. The sheriff said they found maps shredded in whole with names on them. They found gear that belonged to people who'd gone missing or been delayed. They said he had a history of local trespassing and of finding patterns where others saw chaos. The man, when they arrested him, looked like any man who had read too many books about the outdoors and decided to become a character in a story. We never saw him in court. We didn't want to watch it become a spectacle. The deputy, when he came by to check on us a week later, told us the man had been charged with a string of felonies. He said the charges were heavy and would stay heavy long enough that no one could shrug them off. He said people had called the man a manipulator, which felt like useless language given the scale of what he'd done. They said they found in his pocket scraps of maps with different names, a habit, a method. He had used the uniform as a tool, the way anyone might use a uniform to get what they wanted. If there's a moral to any of it, it's small and private. It's about the way trust forms and how it can be exploited. It's about the way names on a map can mean a person and how easy it is to hide a broken thing in a place so big it swallows evidence and people alike. Jess and I stopped hiking for a while. We needed to remember the sound of a stream without thinking it might have been the last place someone went. We went back later, slowly, with proper gear and a different route and a radio that actually worked. We learned to ask for ID and then ask again. We learned that authority can be replicated by anyone with the right shirt and the right timing. The shredded map with the name and marker, we kept a photo of it. The deputy said it was important evidence, so we didn't hold on to the original, but seeing that little corner of paper with Sam on it made everything very close and immediate. It was a thing, a fact. It was a reminder that people who hurt others aren't mythical. They're the most ordinary people, wearing ordinary things and moving through the world like they belong. I don't like telling it because every time I say the man's name, which I won't, the words seem to make him more real in the wrong way. I still have a moment sometimes when I hear the snap of a twig and my body makes the old choices. It settles in the shoulders first, then in the back of the neck. I think about Sam Harper and the way one name on a map became a set of footprints in the mud. I think about how close we came to being unnameable pieces lost among leaves. We survived. We came back to the parking lot, we drank hot coffee from a stranger's thermos, and we told the truth in a way that made men with badges go into the woods with dogs and radios. That made a difference. The man was stopped. He was not a ghost. He was not something we couldn't fight. He was human and flawed and dangerous in a quiet way, and that was scarier than any other idea I had. I still go back into the woods sometimes. I don't go alone. I don't follow strangers, no matter how neatly they're dressed. I ask to see badges. I ask again. I fold the map carefully and keep it where I can feel it against my palm. I check the sky with the same small vigilance I used to check my shoelaces. I watch for the little things, a patch that doesn't say the park, a smile that stays too long, the way someone might imply that they're doing you a favor when they're actually asking you to step into a place where the trees will hide what they want to hide. I woke up because the front door rattled like someone was trying the knob. It wasn't a soft little shove, it was that hard, impatient shaking that made the whole house lean. I sat up so fast my head buzzed. For a second I couldn't tell where I was. The room smelled like the wood stove had gone out in Dewey's breath, and there was that night sound out in the hollow, the insect hum in a faraway truck that never stopped. My phone was on the nightstand. I grabbed it and the screen said no service. I knew that meant the valley had swallowed the bars again. I told myself it was the wind. There's always wind in the holler, a sound that can be a tree branch or someone walking. It had been a windy week, weather was turning toward winter. But the rattle came again, sharper, like a fist against the door. The knob clicked, not turning but jostling. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold on the floorboards. Dewey didn't wake. He was 6, he slept the sleep of kids who don't know any trouble. The hallway light by the kitchen was off because I didn't like light in the night, but the moon was bright enough to make pale shapes on the floor. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The small round glass was smudged on the inside where my eyelashes had touched it. I couldn't see anything. The porch light didn't make it to the bottom of the steps. The angle hid most of the yard. The rattling stopped. Not a fade, a very deliberate stop, like a hand taking itself away. I stood there with my forehead against the door and listened to the house settle. My pulse thudded in my ears. For a full minute the only thing I heard was the tick of the stove cooling and the sound of the creek over the bank doing its quiet job. I walked back to Dewey's room and found him sitting up, clutching his blanket. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was tiny. I think someone was at the window. The bedroom window was down the wall from his bed. It looked out across the yard and into the dark woods on the other side. I told him to stay put and pull the blanket over his head. He did it without arguing, the way kids do when they mean it. I went to the window and peered. There was a handprint in the middle of the glass. It was not the polite little ghost of someone's palm, and it was not a child's either. It was dirty, the smudge of fingernails and lines where the fingers had pressed hard. It was low enough that whoever had put it there had either been short or squatted. The fingers were spread like someone had braced themselves. I put my palm beside it on the inside of the glass and felt the chill. It was real. Everything in me wanted to call the sheriff. I tapped the phone again. Still nothing. I tried the landline, the old rotary in the kitchen that was only there because my mom had left it before she died, and it made me feel tethered. The dial tone was a high, thin thing and then dead air. No connection. The holler had eaten both phones. I kept thinking of things to explain it away. Maybe somebody had been walking by and looked in. Maybe kids from down the road were messing. Maybe a hunter had come too close. I'd lived here 5 years. Most nights nothing happened. But there had been little things lately, things I had pushed to the side because life was heavy and busy. 2 weeks earlier I'd found the chicken feeder knocked over. It was a clumsy thing to be bothered by, but the hens were scared and there were prints in the soft dirt, single sets of boots, too big for a kid. I had blamed raccoons at first, then noticed the prints didn't crisscross like animal prints. They led from the road to the back porch and stopped at the swing where I sometimes drank coffee. The swing was wet the next morning, though I hadn't been out. I told myself I must have left it that way when I came in late, which was something I did more and more. I didn't tell anyone. Who do you tell when you live alone with a kid and the county line is a half hour away? The week before that I'd seen a truck at the corner near the school. It was the kind of truck that didn't usually drive through our part of the valley, white, with a rack. It sat with its lights off for a long time, engine idling, while kids got off the bus. I drove past because Dewey and I were late and I didn't want to be singled out. I told the principal I'd been sick. The next day the truck was gone, but somebody at the post office said a woman up the road had seen the same truck a few days before, parked on the shoulder while a man leaned against a tree and smoked. Men smoked a lot around here, but you don't just park on the shoulder and stare at kids. Those things had made a soft worry in the back of my head. It was a worry the size of a thumb, private and pokey. The handprint on the window felt like the thumb had turned into a hammer. I covered the window with a towel so Dewey couldn't see it again. He slept with his eyes closed, but I could feel him listening. I wanted to wake my neighbor, Mary, who'd raised 3 kids and kept an eye on the valley, but her porch light was off and her car was gone. If she was out, I didn't know where. I thought of running across and pounding on someone's door in the night, but who wants their kids dragged out in the middle of the night? Who wants to be the person who cried wolf? I made breakfast in the morning like nothing had happened. I had coffee, loaded Dewey's backpack, kissed his forehead. He was the same kid who lost one sock in the dryer and came back with a joke. When he left for school, he did a weird little double take at the window. I closed the curtains before I called the sheriff. The dispatcher asked me to come down to the station. Their cars were thinly spread, he said. There had been a burglary up by the state line the week before, and they were following leads. So I told him the main thing. There had been a person in my window last night, handprint on the glass. He took my name and advised extra locks. He told me to call back if anything else happened. He said he'd log it. At noon, I drove to the post office to get the mail, and the man in the blue pickup was at the store. He parked wrong, with the truck taking half the lane. He walked like he was thinking and not paying attention to the people looking at him. He tipped his hat to me when I passed, a small casual nod, and I thought of nothing until later. That afternoon, someone took my trash can and put it back around the bend behind the shed. There was a cigarette, but on the porch, not mine. I don't smoke. It's the little things, I told myself. People leave things. Somebody dropped their cigarette. But the butt was wrapped in a small bit of foil, the kind of paper I had seen once on a man at the store who had bragged about being clean and then would disappear for days. I don't think he knew we noticed him sometimes, but people notice in small towns. A neighbor I trusted more, Lisa from down the road, stopped by that evening with a casserole. She moved like she had town gossip heavy on her tongue and wanted to be careful. She told me she'd seen the truck near the school and that a teacher had mentioned a man asking questions about different kids, what bus they took, what time they got out. The teacher thought it was odd enough to tell the staff. People shouldn't be asking about kids, Lisa said, not trying to make me more scared than I was. You know how folks are. She talked around things like a woman unspooling a spool of thread, careful not to let it snap. I told her about the handprint. She pressed the casserole into my hands and said, "Call me if anything." Her face had the look of someone who knows the world can be kinder or worse depending on who answers the phone. That night I closed the curtains early and checked the locks twice. I had a big kitchen knife in the drawer, a relic from when my husband died, and I couldn't bring myself to throw anything away. I set it on the counter within reach and pretended I wasn't doing it because the shadow in the holler felt longer. At midnight, the dog on the neighbor's place started barking, a long, rolling sound the dog makes when something is wrong. The sound came in waves. It didn't stop. I pressed my ear to the pillow and listened. Dewey's breathing was slow. The dog kept at it, and with each bark the front porch grew clearer in my mind, the planks, the 2 steps, the railing. I heard someone on the road, a muffled engine that didn't speed by, almost as if whoever was driving wanted to listen. The next morning there was a small scrap of paper jammed in my mailbox. It had a phone number and nothing else. No words, just the numbers written in a shaky hand. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. I thought of slipping it into my pocket and calling, but the idea of who might answer made me feel like a kid about to open a trapdoor. The tension did what tension does, it seeped into everything. I started checking the curtains more often during the day. I got annoyed at everyone, at the mailman for taking too long, at Dewey for leaving his shoes in the hallway, because hypervigilance turns normal things into offenses. I slept less. The holler seemed to wait for me to drop my guard, patient and practical, like a trap. The night the door rattled again, I was already wound thin. It was the same hard shaking, only more desperate. Dewey woke and whispered, "He's at the window again, Mama." I put a hand on his back and felt him shiver under the blanket. I told him to be quiet and rolled toward the edge of the bed. The phone was dead again. I went to the living room and listened. The The house sounded the same as always, the old clock on the mantel clicking like footsteps, the water pipes settling. The porch floorboards creaked then, a slow creak as if someone put a foot down and shifted weight. I thought of the handprint low on Dewey's window and my stomach turned. I opened the door a crack and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. The moon lit the yard in a pale wash. There were no footprints in the frost on the steps. I pressed my forehead to the door and felt foolish and afraid. A shadow moved across the road like a person walking far away, not toward the house but pacing along the ditch. It could have been anyone. It could have been someone waiting for a house to be empty. Then there was a sound at the back window, a quiet scrape. My heart thudded and I thought of the woodpile, where we stacked the logs. Whoever it was had gone around the house. They were trying doors, the little patient ways of a thief or someone looking for a gap. I grabbed the keys and my coat, quietly, like doing a job. I covered Dewey's face with a soft blanket and whispered we were going to the truck. He didn't question. He knew when Mama's face went hard that you don't slow down. We crept down the back steps. The back door opened without resistance. Whoever had been on the porch had left the latch undisturbed. My throat closed. I remember thinking about how easy it would have been for them to go in. I think that's when anger and fear split me like lightning. The truck was cold and smelled like old fries. It started on the second turn. I kept the engine idling and watched the house in my rear view. The backlight was a white square. I thought of the living room, the kitchen drawer with the knife, the photographs of better days hanging crooked on the wall. I thought about trusting my neighbors and how sometimes you just had to trust. We should have driven straight to the sheriff's office. I nearly did. Instead, I drove to the top of the road where the gravel met the county road and stopped. The road curved and dipped, and in the hollow at the bottom there was a lone set of headlights facing the wrong way. The truck was idling with the lights off. I waited and watched. Whoever was in it had their silhouette hunched over something, maybe a phone or maybe their hands. I thought panic would make me stomp on the gas and head for town, but instead I sat there while Dew cooled the truck and Dewey's small breath fogged in the cab. A figure stepped out of the dark and crossed to the ditch. He didn't come toward the house. He stood there and smoked a cigarette like he was enjoying the view. The light of the smoke looked wrong in the night. I saw him lift a hand and point, as if at the house. He looked at the road and then at the mailboxes like he was measuring names. I watched him for a long time and then realized my hand had been on the horn. I would have honked and I didn't, because what would it do except make him look up and see me? When he finally started his truck and left, he drove slow. He passed my place and didn't look my way. He kept going down the road, headlights cutting through the hollow. I thought of chasing him, but then thought of the sheriff who said to come in person. I drove to the station and told the deputy what I had seen, and he said he'd send a unit to check the road. They'd be slow, he said. You don't usually get units out here fast unless it's daylight. By the time I got back, the porch was empty and the handprint at Dewey's window had faded from the cold. I cleaned it with the corner of my sleeve even though I knew I shouldn't. I wanted some small cleanliness, some action. The kitchen light felt too sharp. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lamp on and the TV set to a channel that made no sound but gave a small box of light. Dewey fell asleep on the couch with his head on my knees, and I thought of the man at the school and the cigarette in the truck. I thought of the handprint as a thing other than a smudge, as a message. At about 3 in the morning the dog across the way started barking again, and then another dog answered, and then silence. I had the radio on low, breathing out, when the front door rattled, once and hard, like someone testing to see if the house had drooped. I heard movement at the bottom of the porch, a scraping as if someone dragged a foot. I could have called. I could have turned the light on. I could have opened the door and faced whatever my feet would have met. I did none of those things. I stood up and took Dewey in my arms and carried him out the side door that opened to an old path. There was a hollow that led behind the mailbox lot, a path lined with briars. I walked there barefoot and cold and felt the earth give under my heels. It smelled of leaf rot and something like old metal. I wrapped Dewey's blanket tight and walked until the house was a white square behind trees. I left the truck running. I had no plan except movement. Movement seemed like the one thing that would keep us ahead. I thought about the sheriff's deputy, about Mary, about Lisa, and about who answers the phone at 3 in the morning. I thought about calling my sister in Knoxville, but the phone had been no good, and with the truck idling it was gas gone. The road to town was long and slick with early frost. I knew each turn by heart. I had driven them 1,000 times, but at 3 in the morning every turn is a question. When I reached the bottom of the hill, the county road tied into the highway. There were lights then, the long white belly of an interstate with trucks hauling everything. I pulled into a highway convenience store and parked under the sodium glare. The coffee inside steamed and tasted like the kind of thing that steadies. A young man behind the register looked at us like we smelled of smoke and worry. He didn't ask paperwork. "Are you okay?" he asked. He said it like he meant it. "No," I said. "But we're getting there." I kept my voice steady. Dewey dozed in his seat, exhausted. The young man called the sheriff for me. A radio voice came back, slow and professional. The clerk wrote down the deputy's name and told me to sit. I called my sister then because the convenience store had a bar of service like a little island in a sea. I called the sheriff too and told them the truck I'd seen had left, that I had a handprint on the window and that someone had been rattling the door. They told me to wait and not to go back. I sat for what felt like a long time. The neon clock over the soda case blinked 3:57, 4:12, 4:43. My knees ached. The lights of the highway moved. I took Dewey into the restroom and checked for anything on his back or his wrists that might have been a mark. He grunted and rolled over like a kid who hadn't yet made sense of the world. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had called the sheriff and they had said we'll be there, and then not been, and then we had been back at the house and the man had been. The deputy arrived with a state trooper. They asked me to drive them to the house. Their cars were bright and had radios and things that went tick, tick when they walked. The sky above the mountains was turning indigo and the ridge line was a black saw. We wound up the county road toward my place with lights on and sirens off. The deputy did not look surprised to see the truck gone. He radioed for units to pull plates from around the road and for units to look on the other end of the valley. He told me later they'd run the plates of the trucks that had been seen idling in the area and that he'd seen the same pattern before, men who watched and tested a house by rattling a door, collecting what they could when nobody was looking. We drove up past the mailbox and into the driveway. The deputy walked the porch, his boots making a sure sound that settled something in me. He checked the back door and the lock. He found a matchbook under the swing, a different brand from the cigarette but I'd found. He took pictures. He put on gloves, moved with the kind of deliberation people have when there are rules to follow. He told me I had done the right thing to get out. He said he'd seen enough to say it was a good call. They said they'd run the truck's plate number to find where it had been registered. They said they'd canvassed the holler and that volunteers would spread out. The deputy asked if I wanted to go with them to the station for a statement. I did. I wanted to be near the answering phone and the men who had radios and the hold of official time. At the station, the deputy asked me to list everything that had happened, from the trash can to the handprint on the window. I told him about the truck at the corner, the man at the school, the cigarette butts, the prints on the back porch. He wrote it down and asked me if any of it made me think of anyone I knew. "There's a man who came through here sometimes," I said. "White truck." He loitered. Asked about kids. I told him of the teacher's comment of Lisa's casserole. He nodded as if he'd expected that by the time the shell of a pattern reveals itself, other people have put all their little pieces in a pile. They called out units, and within a couple hours a cruiser rolled to a stop at the end of the road. The officer stepped out and said they found the truck turned off inside an old logging pullout, doors closed and no one in sight. They checked plates and found it registered to a local man with prior trespassing complaints. The officer's voice was flat. He said they were going to check the man's cabin and belongings. He said they had a license and a name that matched reports from other counties. I went home with the deputy to get some clothes while they searched. The house felt small and loud. Dewey slept in my bed that day, and I sat up knitting my hands with worry. When the deputy came back hours later, he had gloves and a paper bag. He said the suspect's truck had a small stash of things, maps with names written on them, a badge the guy had printed and laminated, scrapings of tape that matched those on my porch. They had pictures of the man's hands calloused, with a nick across one knuckle, and the deputy said it matched the print at my window. He said they'd arrested the man at his cabin 2 miles down the hollow after a neighbor saw him coming early morning and thought it odd enough to call. The deputy said he'd been asleep when they knocked. They said that in the cabin they found more things that made me bristle the way a bad smell does: notebooks with observations, a camera with photos of houses, a collection of watchful notations. It was not clean. It was persistent. The man was charged. They told me he had prior complaints but no big felony record, the kind of thing the system sometimes sits on until it stacks wrong and then it doesn't matter. The sheriff told me they were putting in for more checks in the valley, better patrols. They told me to get new locks and to consider motion lights. They told me to file for restraining orders if needed. There were forms to fill, numbers to memorize. The weeks after are the ones I remember in small bursts. I remember the girl's face at the school who said she had seen the man and had assumed he was a father. I remember Mary bringing over a casserole again and sitting very close to me like she wanted to make sure we were still real. I remember watching for headlights that didn't belong. I remember Dewey asking once, "Did the man have a dog?" and me rambling about people who did strange things but were caught. There was a hearing. I didn't go. I couldn't handle seeing his face in a room with too much air. The deputy told me later the judge had taken things seriously. They had found things in his truck that tied him to a string of trespassing calls. The man had been held pending trial. I slept better after that, asleep with a lock instead of an open eye. I kept the little things that were proof for me: a photograph the deputy gave me that showed a scrap of plastic with the same brand as the cigarette but I had found on the porch, a photocopy of the man's mugshot with the same calluses on his hand. I taped a note to the inside of my kitchen cupboard that said "new locks installed," and I put a spare key with Mary. I did all the roster things a person does to make worry manageable: light bulbs replaced, curtains changed, numbers written down. Not because it fixed anything, but because it gave me something to do that wasn't waiting. People said things like, "You were brave," and that made me feel small because I hadn't been brave. I had moved. I had put Dewey into a blanket and walked. That was what it came to, choosing action over staying still while the hollow watched. I couldn't sleep with the curtains open anymore. I checked the windows. Dewey and I started sleeping with the bedroom light on and the curtain drawn tight. He started bringing his blanket down to the couch, where I could see him through the living room window from the front porch. He told his teacher at school that sometimes he had trouble sleeping, and the teacher gave him a star for being honest and brave at school. Months later, on a day when the hard frost had melted and the mountain was the rusty color of thaw, the deputy stopped by and handed me a note. It was a recorded call from the man, left on police evidence, where he had named places he'd watched and said he'd have fun if someone let him. The deputy said the tape made his voice sound small and ordinary, the kind of voice that hides behind paper and badges and a truck. He said the man would be in jail for a long time if the prosecutors did their job. I kept walking the same road, because leaving the holler entirely was not something I could do. This was home, the place where my friends shucked corn and the church baked pies and the land held the bones of my people. But I walked differently. I drove a different route to school. I talked more with neighbors. I learned how to check for plates and how to remember details like shirt color and how boots scuff. I learned how to ask questions and not feel like I was being rude. Sometimes, on still nights, I hear a car in the hollow and my stomach goes hard for a second. Sometimes Dewey wakes and asks me if I hear someone at the window and I say no but sit up a little and check. There is a part of me that notices the smallest things, a bent feather on the porch, a tin can moved, a light left on farther down the road, and I do not ignore them. The thing I remember most was not the arrest or the forms or the way the deputy's voice cut the night. It was the handprint on the window and how small a thing it was until it wasn't. It was how a person could reach up and press their palm against your child's glass and change the math of a life. I carry that little fact like a pebble in my pocket, sharp and private, and I use it to check the edges. We were okay. We left the hollow that night and the next day and kept going. The country came through in the way it can, neighbors who would watch for anything, deputies who put in the miles, teachers who asked questions, and the strange, slow work of the law. The man had been human, ordinary in his way, and dangerous in the way only people can be. We got out of the house while he was outside. We drove to the lights and the coffee and the men with radios. We were not harmed, and we were stubborn in not letting small-town loneliness be the thing that let danger in. I still check the porch light and the locks. I still set the spare key with Mary. I still fold Dewey's blanket the way he likes it. I did what I could. I moved. I reported. I kept my son close. That, in the end, was what kept us safe. We went up that old logging road because nobody else seemed to want to. It was one of those routes stuck on the edge of the park map like an afterthought, thin gray line, name in smaller type. Old Ridge Spur. Sam found it on his grandfather's map, the kind with those faded contour lines and the paper smell. He swore by old maps. Less people, more views, he said, like a promise. There were 5 of us, me, Sam, Maya, Leah, and Eric. We all drove out together in 2 cars, laughed in the parking pull-off while tightening boots, and carried the kind of light packs you take on a day that you think will be easy. September was starting to give the mountain that warm, dry smell. Leaves were just beginning to kiss at the edges. The weather app on our phone said clear, no storms. No one thought to worry about anything but bad trail snacks. The trail started like most old logging roads do, wide, lined with stones, easy footing. For the first hour we were loud in the way friends are, joking about who'd bring the worst beard if we ever lived out there, arguing about the best gas station sandwich. The map said 2 forks, then a squeeze through Laurel into a ridge. We tied little ribbons to branches, bright orange flagging Maya brought, mostly to make the way back feel safe. Nobody said it out loud, but we liked the small control of it. Sam stacked a tiny cairn when he found a flat rock. I scratched a notch on a tree with my knife, silly souvenir stuff. The first unsettling thing was small and stupid. We stopped at a bend to drink water, and Sam reached for the ribbon he'd tied to a sapling. It wasn't there. He looked blank for a second, like the world had filleted a piece out of him. Must have come loose, he said. We looked around. No ribbon. No other ribbon we had tied anywhere seemed disturbed. We walked a little farther and found a stone pile, our cairn tipped over, rocks rolled like someone had tapped it with a hand. The scratch on the tree had a fresh blade mark through it, right where I'd left the notch. It was like someone had come along and said, "Not here." We laughed it off. Squirrels with opinions, Eric said. That was what we wanted to believe. But the inside of my stomach had that quiet tick, nothing dramatic, just a sense of a missing thread. The trail got narrower and the forest closed in. The laurel made a green tunnel and everything inside it turned diffuse. Sounds changed. Bird calls were spaced out like someone had put them on a timer. The wind through the high leaves sounded like cloth. There was a far-off thump that might have been a branch, then nothing. Around noon, we climbed into a saddle and stopped to eat. The view was the kind that makes people quiet, ridges rolling on, blue like someone painted sky into land. From up there, you could see the trail we'd taken as a pale scar through trees, thin as a vein. We sat on rocks and ate and talked slower. The map said the trail would drop us onto an old spur in another 2 hours. We drank and tied another ribbon, Maya insisted, this time on a low branch where it wouldn't blow off. We joked about making it an art project, the Ribbon Trail, 2025. That's when the second strange thing happened. Leah picked up something half buried in the dirt beside the saddle. It was a scrap of advertising paper, one side caked in mud. She wiped it with her thumb and read aloud. It was a card for a saw shop 2 counties over, someone's business card. There was a cigarette but tucked in the fold, not old, not withered into a twig but still with ash. Eric said maybe some work crew had been here. Sam frowned and said, but this is way too far from the road for a crew to be sitting and smoking. He rubbed the ash on his boot as if to show it was real. We shrugged it off again. Hikers drop things. Smokers leave butts everywhere. We all had our little ways of excusing the forest. We packed and kept moving. The path dropped and then squeezed through rhododendron that made shoulders brush and breath shallow. The light slid away faster under that green ceiling. I remember thinking I could feel every pair of eyes in the world like tiny pings on my back, nothing to do with seeing, just the small nervousness that comes with being a place people don't usually go. By the time we hit what the map called the Old Spur, the trail had gone from a road to a goat path. Roots were like ribs and the ground fell badly on one side. Our ribbons were little bright scars on gray bark. We were on schedule. We were tired and chatty. Sam was checking the map while Maya adjusted her pack and Leah fished out granola. I was fiddling with my knife, carving another notch in a tree like a child might count days. We walked for another hour and then we came up on it, a chain rusted old, stretched across the path, looped through an iron ring bolted to a post on one side and a big oak on the other. There was a sign stapled to the chain, letters faded but legible, "No trespassing, private property." The staples had fresh rust on them, like they'd been put there a while back but not too long. The chain sagged in a way that suggested it had been moved a lot. None of us had seen it on the map. None of us had noticed any indication on earlier parts of the trail that you needed to diverge. The chain had been out of nowhere, like a hand put in front of us. Sam muttered, "That's new." His voice was flat in a way that didn't fit the day. We all stared at the chain, and for 1 minute no one moved. Leah laughed like a cough. "Okay, rustic. Fine. Private property. We'll go around." She went to step over the chain and found the ground beyond it was trampled smooth and the leaves pressed into the dirt like someone had walked the same path for years. There was no clear alternate route shown on the map, but we figured we could skirt around, go through some thicker trees, keep the ridge on our left and come back to the route the map called for. We didn't want trouble. None of us wanted an argument with whoever had put a chain in the woods. We didn't want to be accused of trespassing. But we also didn't want to turn back and drive 2 hours for nothing. That's when Sam realized something else. The ribbons we tied, the ones on the low branch and the notch and the cairn, were all gone. Not blown off, not frayed. Gone. As if someone had gone behind us and taken them down. The little stone pile we'd made that morning was rearranged into a tiny tower, rocks neat and flat like someone had thought about balance. The scratch on the tree had been scraped deeper, and another scratch mark, like a different knife, had been made below it. Nothing violent, just modifications, as if someone wanted to rewrite what we'd written. "Okay," Maya said slowly. That's not a coincidence. The tree line felt closer. The sound in the woods tightened. Eric stepped closer to the chain and crouched. He frowned at the ground and pointed. A cigarette had been pushed into the dirt and was still smoldering. Smoke rose thin and sweet like someone had just put the end out with their shoe. There were tiny white bits of ash in the but looked new, that white paper still soft and not yet weathered. Someone had been there, recently, after we went past. Whoever it was had been close enough to pull down our markers and to staple a sign across the trail. We all moved like we'd been waiting for permission. Leah reached under the chain and picked up the cigarette, but in her gloved fingers. She didn't flick it into the leaves, she tucked it into a Ziploc. "We should call someone," she said. I pulled my phone out and it said nothing but the word "no service" in miserable black. Sam's phone had one little dot, like a hair of reception, and he tried to call. It rang once and then died. We tried every phone like it was a charm that might make the world change. No one could get a signal in that hollow. The map on Sam's grandfather's paper had been useless for chains and sudden property lines. The forest felt a little too quiet for the five of us. We stood there for a long time like that, not sure whether to go forward and find the person who had been following us or to go back the way we came. The group was split in that funny way friends get when one or two people feel something sharper. Eric wanted to go back, Leah wanted to go forward, Maya wanted to call someone but couldn't. Sam kept looking at the map as if it might explain that a chain could appear in between pencil lines. We decided to go around the chain, hugging the slope and stepping carefully where the root systems gave purchase. The underbrush was thick, it clawed at our pants and made our breathing shallow. The path we made was not the trail, it was a compromise between not trespassing and not being beaten out of curiosity. We walked in a file, one by one, quiet. The people who do act brave in movies always look braver. In real life, your limbs feel heavy, and you make a lot of little decisions like take the right step now that don't feel like heroics at all. A half mile on, the path we had come through earlier was gone. The gray line we'd attempted to follow on the map was a tangle that disappeared into scrub. The sun that had been at our backs moved like a slow clock. All of our little markers, ribbons, the scratch, the cairn were still missing. We stopped and tried to find them, peering into the laurel, calling their names like they were people who'd wandered off. Nothing. The forest looked as if it had swallowed the memory of our passing and then wiped the plate clean. At that point we all slowed to the pace that says, "We're being watched." I know that phrase is the lazy one people say when they can't explain a feeling. What I mean is, our conversation dried up and we started listening. The forest was not loud. In fact, it was the opposite, the spaces between sounds seemed larger. We could hear each other's breathing. There were the tiny animal noises you ignore until you don't, and a distant, steady sound we couldn't place. Maybe a generator, maybe a truck, low and far. Once in a while we'd hear a twig break in a place where we hadn't put our feet. Sam said, "We need to turn back. We need to go home." His voice was even, but his hands were white around the map. Leah said, "We left our car keys at the trailhead, don't freak." We argued, half joking, half panicked, like people do when a solid choice would be less fun. We went back. We tried to retrace our steps. We walked the line we thought we had made and nothing matched. The ridge looked wrong. When we found a rock formation that should have been a landmark, it had been somehow pushed aside, as if our minds had been tampered with. Sometimes I remember it as the trees being the wrong spacings. Other times I remember the smell. Someone had burned coffee in the last hours, like ground beans dumped into a fire, wafting through the green. We stopped when Eric found it, a footprint in the mud, half melted, shoe tread like the kind of work boots local crews wear. At the same spot, the dirt had an imprint of a bike tire but deeper, like someone had dragged something. We followed the prints with the same dreaded curiosity that keeps rats circling. The prints led not to the road but deeper into the trees, cutting across what our map called the main path. The cigarette butt we had found near the chain matched the ash by the boot print, a cheap brand, low tar, the sort of thing you see left on a porch step. I remember how the air felt when we realized someone had taken our ribbons on purpose. You could taste the plan. It wasn't random. Whoever had taken them wanted us to think we were lost. They wanted us to go where they wanted us to go. We were trying to decide what to do when a sound came from above us like a person humming, no words, a low, single note, then a shadow moved along the ridge. It took me a second to realize it wasn't a deer or a bear. It was a person walking the top of the ridge, broad shoulders, hat. He wasn't on our axis, he was on the horizon, watching us through branches. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. He seemed to be unwrapping something in his hands, and then he lit a cigarette. The smoke waved and then drifted away. He looked like he was making himself at home up there. Sam said, "There he is." My voice sounded small and far. We stood frozen. The person on the ridge raised his hand once like a slow signal and lowered it. He kept smoking. There was no yelling, no run, just the same calm that says he wanted us to know he saw us and to do nothing about it. The worst part wasn't that he watched. It was how comfortable he looked doing it. Leah whispered, "We should leave. Now." We didn't move fast enough. The man on the ridge started walking down toward us. Not run, not come with arms spread, just a slow walk that made my teeth ache. His gait was sure. He looked like he had every path in his head, and none of them involved asking permission. When he reached the chain, he didn't bother with the sign. He unhooked it at one corner and swung it aside, the metal ringing like a bell. He was maybe in his 40s, with a thick jacket, a beard that had been clipped but not shaved recently, and a pair of hands that looked used to work. He had a cigarette between his fingers. The smoke curled around his mouth like a shield. "Afternoon," he said. He didn't sound friendly. He sounded like someone who'd practiced saying afternoon to make people lower their eyes. Sam stepped forward a little. "We were just on the trail," he said. "We didn't see any signs earlier. We thought it was public." The man squinted at us like the sun had a name. "Not public," he said. "This land's been private since my granddaddy's time. Folks don't need to be poking around where they don't belong." We tried to explain about maps and old logging roads and public access. He cut us off in a small, sharp way. "Maps don't mean a damn thing to me out here. You take what you want, you pay for it, or you get out." He kept his cigarette like he might throw it at our shoes if he wanted. He didn't smile, but there was a kind of attention to his face that felt like an animal's predation, small checks, small adjustments. The way he stood made us all feel younger by comparison. Maya tried to be reasonable. "Sir, we didn't know. We can go back, no problem. We don't want trouble." He looked at Maya like he knew about moshing and promises. He said, "You can go back, sure. But it don't matter what you want. I don't like people. People bring trash and dogs and leave things." He didn't say, "We'll get the sheriff." He didn't say, "I'll let you go." He said, "I don't like people." The sentence had a finish to it, like a verdict. I remember how small my hands felt on my pack strap. Leah had a look like she wanted to run. Eric's face had gone hard. Sam kept fiddling with the old map, like it might explain itself if he stared hard enough. The man smoked and watched us breathe. He seemed to be deciding whether we were a hassle worth the bother. He didn't smile. Then we heard a sound from the trees behind him, another crack of a branch, and the man turned slightly toward the sound. For a breath, we got a wide, clear view of him, no guardrail anymore between us, and he tightened his jaw. Another figure appeared just behind the first man, another man with a hood and a pack. There was a third shadow beyond them. They were not all the same. Some seemed older, some younger. None smiled. The cigarette butt had not been random at all. It matched the ones we found at the chain. They had been following us, cutting down our markers, stapling signs on the trail, and letting us find the chain like a lesson. It felt modeled, exactly like something meant to stamp a name on our actions. "Get out," the man said. Not loud, not yelling. He spoke like a person shutting a door. Sam tried to keep the peace. "We're leaving," he said. He started to edge back, pushing through the laurel. We followed, single file, boots slipping on loose roots. But the path we'd been using to go around the chain was not where it used to be. The men moved with a kind of slow choreography, stepping to block our chosen turns. Each time we tried to move off to the left, one of them would already be there, not loud, just present. The woods tightened. The small noises we'd grown used to, cicadas, a distant stream, suddenly felt like the background of someone setting a stage. The men's silence was the loudest thing. Their presence folded our options like a map. "Listen," the first man said. He shoved his hands in his jacket. In one, there was a metal object, maybe a knife, maybe nothing. I couldn't tell. "This is private. You go out the way you come in, or you go out past the old quarry. It's easier for me to watch you go around. Don't make me tell you twice." He smiled then in a small, slow way, the sort of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. There was a cold, practical intelligence about him that made my mouth taste like pennies. I looked at my friends and saw the same thing in all of them, the exchange of a look that said no one wanted to be the hero. We were tired. We were 5. The men were quiet and patient and knew the ground. We backed up. We kept our faces empty, our hands visible. Nobody ran. Every time one of us looked down to shake off a branch, the men looked at us like they were checking parts of a machine. We managed to get to where we'd been earlier, the chain of metal mouth over the path. The first man didn't stop us, just watched. He pointed at the chain with the smoke between his fingers and said, "Don't come back. If you come back, I can make it uncomfortable." We left. The forest watched us leave. The climb down felt like stepping out of someone else's story. We moved in silence for a long time, our breath heavy. At one point Eric broke and laughed, a small peal that sounded like a thing going badly wrong. Leah cried real, small sobs behind her hand. Sam walked with the map held in both hands like a talisman. Once we were far enough down the ridge we dared to stop. We ate stale sandwiches and drank water and checked phones again. Sam finally got a single bar and a voicemail connection. He called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher told him to call back when we were safe and to get to the nearest ranger station if possible. Sam said we'd been told to leave and that men had been watching us and removing markers. The voice on the other end sounded like someone who'd gotten this sort of call before and had a routine for it. "We'll send someone out," the dispatcher said. "It might take a while." We decided to head for the main road. We kept a slow walk, lit with the kind of focused fear that made you notice everything: odd scrape marks on trees, fresh cigarette butts where there had been none, a string tied to a sapling that had been cut away and then placed like a trap. The prints on the path were more than one set now. They crisscrossed everything like the outline of a hand. We made it back to the cars after a long sweat. The parking pull-off felt too small for everything that had happened. Sam's grandfather's map was folded in his pocket, creased like an old secret. We filed into cars and for a while none of us spoke much. The drive down the mountain was a blur of radio static and the smell of wet sweat. We stopped at a gas station at the bottom of the hollow and called the number again from the payphone there. The sheriff said they'd send a unit out to check the ridge. At the station, an officer took our statements in a small office that had the echoes of everyone who'd come through before. He didn't look surprised. "These folks do this," he said. "They mark boundaries and get folks to back off. Sometimes it's just posturing. Sometimes it's more." He asked us to identify the men if we could, to tell him every little thing we remembered. He wrote it all down. There were pictures to take. There was a formal report. He told us they would check the ridge and the chain and see if the landowner had a right to put up a barrier like that. After we calmed enough to feel hollow and shaky rather than panicked, someone from the sheriff's department called us with a follow-up. They had gone up to the ridge and found the chain and sign in the butts and a few tattered ribbons, plus evidence of a campsite one of the men had used. The property in question had a complicated history, old deeds, claims, and counterclaims. The deputy said it was messy. He said the men had been identified as landowners in a nearby hollow and that they had prior complaints of intimidating hikers. But he also said the men had not been arrested, no crime had been committed that day that was straightforward enough to charge. "We'll keep an eye," he told us. We didn't walk the ridge again. None of us wanted to be polite in a place where politeness felt like permission. We got our cars and drove different ways back to our lives. I don't think we said much on the way home. There were texts later and jokes that were too small to mean anything. But even in the bright light of the city, the memory of the man on the ridge would pop into my head and make my hands clench. Months later, the county put up a notice about trespassing in property lines, and the Ranger Service posted maps online clarifying access points. There were meetings in the town hall where people argued and people cried. A man filed a complaint and another filed one back. The whole thing got wrapped into bureaucracy and legal forms, and the smell of the forest was turned into signatures. The phrase "we were lucky" is the thing people said, because the men on the ridge could have done more than stand there and look. They could have been the sort of men who escalate. Maybe they were. Maybe they were just territorial and bad-tempered. The fact we left and weren't harmed got called luck. I call it something like luck and something like a string of bad choices we were able to step away from. We made the call to leave. We didn't try to force a confrontation. We didn't take a photograph of the man's face because the way he stood made our phones seem like a stupid idea. A few weeks after the day on the ridge, there was news that a group had been charged in a neighboring county with intimidation for a string of incidents like the one we experienced, the sort of thing where people take the law into their own hands and make the woods their private kingdom. The sheriff called me and asked if I wanted to come in and identify the men from photos. I did. I went and sat in a room that smelled like coffee and paper and looked at thin photos of faces. I didn't want to look, but I had to say yes, this was one of them. This was the one who had smoked and smiled. I pointed, my finger like a small tick. The deputy thanked me and said they'd add it to the file. They said charges would follow. There were court dates, paperwork, a slow grinding that felt like someone turning a millstone. I didn't think about it every day after that, but when a friend suggested a hike somewhere with a map you could trust, I said yes and felt the muscles around my chest ease. We changed the way we did things. We tied ribbons only where we could see them from both directions. We carried whistles and made sure phones were charged and pockets were full of small things: extra water, a pocket knife, a small can of mace that felt ugly to buy but sensible to carry. We stopped leaving trash, stupid things. We started checking the landowner's notices when the map said private. We learned to be loud in the right places and quiet somewhere else. But mostly what I remember is how small the things were before the men showed up. A ribbon gone. A cairn rearranged. A cigarette burning in the dirt. You think of big threats as big, obvious things, but these were small. They were patient. They changed the landscape of our steps in inches. And once you know that someone has been within inches of your sleep, the world doesn't feel the same. We were okay. We walked out. We made it to the cars and the highway and the coffee shop and the slow work of telling people about it and making them believe. Every now and then, when I'm looking at a map or tying a ribbon to a trail, I remember the chain across the path and the man who smoked and watched. I remember the smell of the ash in the dirt and how a minute decision, go forward, go back, made all the difference. I keep thinking of the cigarette, but in the Ziploc in my pack, folded into a pocket of paper like evidence someone else might understand. I don't take it out. I don't need to. We walked away that day. We watched our steps from then on. We were lucky in a way that felt thin and loud. I keep our story in my head as a plain list of things. Chain, sign, ribbons missing, cigarettes smoldering, men on the ridge. Small facts you can say without trauma. They are the things that became the map I trust now, one that isn't printed on paper, but made of experience. We bought the cabin because we were tired of the city noise and the bills and the landlord who never fixed the heater. It was cheap, too cheap, maybe, but it sat in a hollow off a gravel road, down a switchback, with a creek that hummed all year. Jen and I figured we could fix it up. We liked the idea of a place that needed work. It felt honest. The realtor handed us a stack of papers, shrugged at the old septic, and said people liked the quiet out that way. Quiet was the selling point. The hollow was narrow. The trees came close and the sun sat later than it used to. Our closest neighbor was a trailer a little ways down, parked just where the hill flattened into a yard. We met them the first week because we wanted to say hello and bring a pie or whatever you do in places you want to be part of. The family in the trailer, a man, a woman, 2 teenage kids, were outside. The woman had a cigarette and the man had a beer. The kids just watched, arms folded. We waved. They didn't wave back. The man lifted his beer in that half salute people do when they want to be polite and not actually talk. The woman squinted like she was trying to decide if she recognized us. The kids looked away when Jen said hi. I remember thinking it was rude, but then thinking about how not everyone in small towns warmed up quick to new folks. We moved in anyway. At first the hollow felt exactly like what we wanted. Mornings were birds and the creek and the thump of our own hammers. Nights were long and full of the small sounds of the house, the stove settling, the old pipes jangling, and then silence, which was fine because we liked listening to silence. We painted, we hauled insulation, we tore a carpet. Jen painted the bedroom a ridiculous blue that made the mountain light look even softer when it hit the walls. I put my toolbox in a corner like it was an altar. The watching started small. I noticed it at first like you notice a storm cloud in the corner of your eye. We'd be working out front and someone from the trailer would be on their porch, just sitting and looking. Not doing anything, not smoking or fiddling, just looking. Sometimes the woman would be bent over a pail, and her head would be lifted as if she had broken her rhythm to watch the way we moved a sheet of plywood. Sometimes it was the kids at the window, the blinds cracked so a sliver of face could peek through. Never a hi, never a wave. Just watching. You read about being looked at and you think it's a thing you make up to feel important. It's not. It was a steady attention like somebody running a hand along the rim of a glass to see if it was clean. Then the knocking started. It was always light at first, like someone tapping with the knuckle of a finger. It was the kind of noise you convince yourself is the house settling or a branch. We heard it the first night after we put the bed together, 3 soft knocks on the outside wall, porch side, right near the bedroom. I remember waking up because Jen whispered and then said, probably raccoons. We rolled over and went back to sleep. Raccoons, I thought. Wildlife will get into everything. But the knocks kept happening. Not every night, not predictable, but often enough that it stopped being background noise. Sometimes they would come in the early hours, like 2 a.m., 3 soft knocks, a pause, and then another pair. Sometimes they would be on the kitchen wall, near the sink. sometimes on the porch railing. Once they were right under the window where Jen slept, 3 slow, measured taps, like someone was checking to see if a person inside would move. We would get up and look out and the porch would be empty. The grass would be untroubled. No footprints, no flashlight beam, no stray cigarette. The knocks left no trace but the way your skin prickles when you think something is wrong. We started locking doors, of course. Deadbolt every time, chain. We took the latch off the side as an extra because we'd read about people reaching through to unlock. We installed a simple magnet alarm from the hardware store that made a tiny, ear-scratching sound when a door opened. The first night we had that alarm, it never went off except once when the cat knocked a glass off a table. We felt safer. You don't know how much a metal bite in a door will calm you until you have it. Then, the day I woke and the front door was wide open. I remembered locking it. I remember checking the deadbolt before we went to bed because the creak was louder with rain and I had that small survival paranoia you get when you live somewhere new. I remember the chain clipped on, the knob turned, the whirl of the deadbolt. I remember shutting the porch light. I remember the sound of the curtains closing. I know because I replayed it in my head 100 different ways after. I woke before dawn because the house sounded wrong. It was quiet in a clean way, like either everything had been put away or someone had taken the room and pressed it flat. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling and my brain made a list of things to do. I'd left the keys in the jar by the kitchen. I thought of coffee. And then I saw the dark witch of the open doorway at the far end of the hall. The door stood open all the way wide, the chain off, the deadbolt unchambered. The night air moved in like a person had left it that way on purpose. There was a drip of water on the mat and a smear of mud across the threshold. Not animal mud, wood shoe mud, the kind with gravel and a small, fine grit that gets into carpet. I stepped barefoot into it and the cold bit my heel. My first thought was that I had forgotten to lock it. My second thought was of Jen and how she would have been the first to notice if we'd left things unlocked. I roused her. She sat up, hair in a knot, eyes the color of someone who'd been sleeping and suddenly had to be awake. Doors open, I said, too loud in the empty house. She swung her legs out of bed and did the thing you do when you're not sure if you're awake. She checked the windows. They were all latched. The back door was shut. We tiptoed downstairs. The house smelled faintly of smoke and coffee, like someone had been there and had taken a sip and left. We didn't have a security camera. We lived dumb in some ways. The Hollow didn't have great internet and cameras are more hassle than they sound. We had the magnet alarm and 2 locks and a dog bone of common sense. I shut the door and clicked the bolt. My hands were wet with cold. I checked every room and left the lights on like an idiot. There was nothing taken. The drawers were closed. The TV was off. The sugar jar in the kitchen had a fresh ring of spill on the counter, as if someone had set down a mug and lifted it. A single cigarette butt lay in the ashtray on the porch table. The brand people in the trailer smoked. I remember there being a curl of gray ash, still warm. We called the sheriff. That was a thing we did even though we knew the road for the sheriff was long and the station was a small blue building with a sleepy man in a sun-faded uniform who knew the other folks at the trailer. The dispatcher asked questions like this was a paper exercise. Were there signs of forced entry? Do you have cameras? Did you see anyone? I told them about the mud and the cigarette and the deadbolt. The voice on the other end said someone would send a unit when they could. While we waited, we did the other things people do when they need to make worry feel like action. We checked the crawl space with a flashlight and a long screwdriver. We felt along the rafters in the attic with the flashlight because who knows what people do up there. The crawl space smelled like damp earth and old insulation. There was a scrap of cloth tucked under the insulation like it had been pressed there by a hand. It might have been nothing. It might have been something. We put it into a paper bag and labeled it. The deputy who eventually came took photos in the bag and said the thing you expect from a man who hears these calls all the time. Sometimes it's kids, sometimes it's drunks, sometimes it's reliefs that don't amount to a thing. He wrote it all down and drove off. The family at the trailer watched us the whole time we filed the report. When the deputy's truck left, the man from the trailer walked down to the end of his yard and stood where the ditch started. He lifted his chin like he was trying to see better. The kids were at his elbow. The woman smoked and squinted. None of them waved at us. Their silence felt like a second kind of weather, a plain, steady thing that covered everything. That first night we didn't sleep. Jen curled next to me and checked every noise like she could catch it. I got up and put a chair propped against the bedroom door. I don't know why, exactly. It felt like a small defiance. The house is an old thing with old bones and it makes a lot of noise, and you will get used to the sounds until there are threads in the room. But now every groan and tick made my gut flip. Over the next few weeks the pattern built like a slow drip into my head. The knocks kept coming, always remote, never loud. The trailer family were always outside when the sun went down, sitting and watching us feed the wood stove or stack shingles or take down rotten boards. Small things were moved in the night sometimes. My tool bag left open with a ratcheting wrench missing, the handle of the back gate latched and then found unlatched in the morning, the porch mat that I swear I had straightened the night before found in a corner as if someone had belly scraped across it. Once, a jar of clear pickles that had been on the shelf ended up in the sink with water spilled around it. Nothing dramatic, but the grammar of these little movements made a language in my head that read someone was here. We asked the woman from the trailer to come over and have some coffee. Jen is the kind of person who will try to fix things the way people fix fences, with conversation and pie. The woman made a face and said she was busy. She did not come over. When she did talk, she talked around things, like people move in. You get used to it. She didn't say it like a warning. It sounded like a report. At night, the house would get quiet around 2 a.m. and then the knocks would come. Once, they came under the back window in a pattern so precise I thought of someone measuring time. 1 knock, 2 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. The worst part wasn't the knock itself. It was the silence that followed, like someone listening for your breath to stop. Jen would sit in the dark and breathe like a person on a rope, and then I'd take the flashlight down the hall and check the porch. It was always empty. We bought a cheap motion sensor light and put it on the side of the porch that faced the trailer. It must have shone right into the trailer yard because the next evening the man from the trailer turned his head and glared like it was a provocation. There was an argument across the barely lit space about whether we had a right to blind them with light. They said it hurt their eyes. We said we'd pay for a shield if it did. The woman spat tobacco in a small arc. The neighbor's daughter watched from the curtains. No one raised hands, no one moved past yelling. Then Jen found the nail gun cartridge missing from my tool tote. It was something small, maybe $40, but it wasn't the price that mattered, it was the proof. Someone had gone in, opened a bag in the dark, and taken something they'd need. We set a little plan that night like people who expect trouble will do. Lock everything, light everything, keep a radio on low. I also set out a small trail of baby powder around the back door because I had read once that flour catches footprints. It felt desperate and stupid. That night the powder was disturbed in the morning and there were shoe prints in it, neat as if someone had stepped carefully so the tread would read. The prints left the porch and led toward the tree line but did not come from any major path. They seemed to have been made by a boot with a deep lug pattern. I took a picture with my phone and later the deputy said it was worth putting in the file. We reported it, again. The deputy told us to be careful. He said now that we had reported evidence they'd try to patrol more. He also said that there are folks out here who believe the land is open and that people from the city don't understand that. He said it with a shrug like words on his part would change it. He took our statement, rubbed at his eyes, and told us to consider leaving the door locked and to call at once if we heard anything else. The knocking started to change. It came at noon once, a slow single knock at the kitchen wall like someone testing whether we'd be asleep. We checked and found fresh cigarette ash on the rail near the window. When I leaned out the window, you could see a faint path in the leaves where someone had crouched. The ash matched the brand the woman smoked, but nothing is neat in these cases. People share brands and kids pick up packs and toss them. The point was it wasn't random. It was someone close. I tried to set a camera once. I bought the cheap kind, one that runs on its own battery and stores to a memory card, and nailed it above the porch pointing down. It was clumsy. We set it up the way you set up a mousetrap, hopeful and modest. The camera recorded nothing but the neighbor's porch light at night and the occasional owl. The SD card, when I checked it, made my face small. There were hours of nothing, punctuated by a single 5-second clip where the porch light flared and a shadow moved fast across the lens like a hand. The clip was too quick to see faces. The deputy looked at it and said, "Could be anyone," which is not the sentence you wanted to hear when you were thin with fear. The thing that finally turned the worrying into real terror happened on a damp Friday. Jen and I had been bickering about the faucet and a bill and the paint color for the bathroom. Nothing of note. We went to bed early because we were exhausted. I woke up around 3 because the alarm that I hadn't set, the cheap door magnet, was making that tiny scratchy beep. I blinked and heard the house with that big empty brain, the pipes, the fridge, the creak. Then I heard a different sound. Something soft and slow in the hall, like fabric on floorboards. I slipped out of bed and went down the hall. The door was closed and the latch was set like we'd left it. The deadbolt was not. That is a sentence that stops your throat. The bolt was out, the chain unhooked. Someone had opened the deadbolt somewhere between my first check and now. I remember the smell first, cigarette smoke and something oily, like a hand had been in a machine. Then I remember hearing a sound in the living room, the small noise someone makes when they set down a mug. The living room lamp was off. There was the low glint of moon on a metallic thing by the couch. I remember my hands finding the flashlight and the heft of it. I remember thinking the reasonable thing, call for help. But my phone was on the kitchen counter and the reception here is either nothing or one bar that will die on you like an animal in a trap. I couldn't depend on that. I crept into the living room and there in the moonlight on the couch was a man I had seen 1,000 times from a distance. In the trailer yard, only up close he had the roughness of someone who had slept without a bed. He had a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. It glowered like a small coal. He wasn't making any move like he wanted to hurt us. He just sat like he had a right to be there, as if the couch belonged to him by some slow law of habit. He didn't startle. He didn't look wild. He looked bored. He looked like a person who had been placed in our living room by time and weather and had sat there to see what would happen. I made a noise, a stupid human noise between a whisper and an exhalation. He didn't move. I pointed the flashlight at him like I was revealing a painting. His face was weathered, a little paint on his jacket, a blue collar chewed at. He took a drag of his cigarette like he was savoring it and then said, "Well, morning." For a beat my brain refused grammar. Then it made a sentence, "What are you doing in my house?" I don't remember how loud I was or how small my voice, just that the sentence wanted seeds. He shrugged. "Needed a place to wait out the rain," he said like it was the most natural thing. "You folks don't mind, right?" The living room was suddenly too bright. Jen moved behind me with that small sound women make when they're terrified but steady. The man leaned forward and flicked ash onto the rug, slow as if he owned the motion. You can tell when a person slips from trespasser into threat by small signs, how they hold their hands, the way they count distance. He had a way of tilting his head that suggested he had spent a lot of time watching. "Get out," I said. There is a particular hope you carry when you say that, that the person will be reasonable, that he will say sorry, that the world will fold back in on itself. He did not say sorry. He did not get up. He took another drag and then looked at me, and this is the thing I can still see. His eyes calm, his mouth aligned, and then, as if this were negotiation, he said, "We don't want trouble either." The house smelled like smoke and that iron taste of possible violence. I edged toward the kitchen counter where my phone lived like an offering. My hand closed on it. He watched. Good. Bad. I don't know. I told him to leave and he said he would if we gave him down payment of what? I can't say. He wasn't explicit. He wanted us to be small and helpless and make choices that made us vulnerable. I didn't give him anything. I moved the chair and shoved it against the door, the way a small man shoves a note under a heavy thing. He got up then, slowly, and I thought for a moment he would fight through the door. But he didn't. He walked to the window and looked out at the trailer like he was checking in with the family, and then he shrugged like a man who'd done what he came to do and wasn't bothered by our fussing. He picked up a coat that he hadn't come in wearing, slung it over his shoulders, and then, with the casual contempt of someone who has been unaccountably granted time, he walked out through the front and closed the door behind him. We heard the porch floor creak. I didn't think to breathe. He walked down the steps and the light from our cheap motion sensor caught him and made him a silhouette. He walked to his truck, drove off. The headlights flared once, then were gone. We called the sheriff then. We called like people who were shaking. The deputy came, slower than you'd like but faster than we expected. He asked the usual questions and then, when the man was identified from our descriptions, he drove to the trailer and had a long conversation with the family. I learned that morning that sometimes people will deny things with the calmness of someone reciting a script. They told the deputy he hadn't been there, that nobody from their place had been in our house. The daughter cried a little and said something about him being a friend who came by sometimes to borrow tools. The deputy took our statements and then told us, plainly, that the man was known to sleep in other folks' sheds sometimes and that he had prior trespassing complaints. He said he would talk to the man and try to get him to stay away. I wanted him to promise to lock him up. He didn't promise that because he couldn't. He promised instead to watch, to patrol, to write it down. We did what scared people do with the things they have. We left. That week we put our stuff in the truck and stayed in a motel over on the highway. We slept with the radio on and with lights checked like people who have had the sky come down close. The deputy called the next morning and said he'd found a sleeping bag under the trailer and some of the tools we had thought gone. He said he had a word. He said men who were homeless or who had figured out how to get by in the holler sometimes walked a fine line between being helpless and being a threat. He said he would file charges if we wanted, but that sometimes the paper doesn't help when the money and the habit are all the man has. We went back because we had to. You can't leave a house with a mortgage and a creek and a whole life if you don't have to. We changed the locks to something a little ridiculous, a deadbolt that you need 3 hands to open, and we put up a brighter light and a second lock on the chain and a little bell. We also put contact information for the deputy and a neighbor and one of Jen's sisters on a note by the phone. It felt like paperwork would be a barrier, like a fence. The trailer family started to treat us like we had moved into a strange orbit. They were outside less. The mother smoked in the back more often, looking away when we walked by. The kids would pull the curtains tighter. For a while the knocking stopped. For a while the house became a place where the pipes sang and the wood stove warmed and the creak in the floor sounded like an instrument in time again. But people are patient when they are not satisfied. You can change locks and you can get deputy promises and you can spend the money to stop the storm in a small way, but there were still little things. A window left cracked and a cigarette butt on the sill. A porch mat shifted. One time I found a small pile of stones by the back fence that looked like they'd been placed there for a reason we couldn't name, a little rude monument in stone. Once, when Jen was out getting groceries, someone had walked across the lawn and left a line of boot prints leading to the spot where she had been planting bulbs. The prints went to the place where she had been crouched and then stopped, like someone had leaned in to look at what she was doing, then left. We stopped going out at night alone. We ate faster dinners and lit the driveway light earlier and left our radio on low. Jen started leaving the curtains open until late so the house would look like a place where people were awake. We started locking the car in the garage and leaving a spare key with a neighbor we trusted 2 hollows over. We learned the names of the deputies who would take our calls, and we learned when they worked and when they didn't. We learned that the law moves in slow, practical circles out here, and sometimes it arrives and sometimes it doesn't. Months passed. The man who had been in the house got arrested eventually for breaking into someone else's barn, not ours. But when the deputy who arrested him told us about the evidence they found in his truck, a small camera, a notebook with notes like house light 2:03 a.m., door open, there was a new kind of cold. It meant what we had suspected had a shape you could hold in your hands. They found more things, a list of names of houses on the road, a few more of our tools, a small roll of cable wire. The deputy told us there was more than one person in the pattern, people who would test doors and wait and come back. People who had learned the geography in a way that made them invisible until they wanted to be seen. When they took the man in, his face looked small like anyone's face looks in the thin light of a cell. The trailer family swore they hadn't known he was using their property. The woman cried a little in the doorway, and maybe she didn't lie, maybe she had known and chosen not to say. People choose for reasons you will never fully know until you have to live inside the choice. We sold the cabin the next year. Not because it was the only thing to do, but because every time I nailed a board back together I felt like I was hiding something in place instead of fixing it. The hollow is beautiful, the creek is honest. But for the months we lived there, the hollow had been less a place than a pressure. It was like having someone lean on your chest in slow increments and expect you to get used to it. We kept a few useless things after: the bell we had hung by the door, a photograph the deputy had taken of the cigarette butts they matched to a pack in the man's truck. We kept a spiral notebook where we had written down dates and times and the pattern of knocks. It sits in a drawer now. Sometimes I pull it out like a thing to look at with the careful distance of someone who survived. There are things you tell yourself after you step out of something bad. You tell yourself they were small miracles, that you were lucky, that you did what you could. Those are true enough as sentences. But the real memory that sits on top of them like a weight is small and plain: the man who sat on our couch with a cigarette and watched us like we were an exhibit. The quiet tap on the wall at 2 a.m. The mat turned to the corner in the morning. The way the neighbor's trailer curtains would crack and reveal a child's face just long enough to be counted. We managed the thing people want most in a situation like that. We noticed the pattern and we left before it could be worse. We lived long enough to decide that the house was not worth the shape of our nights. We moved to a town with lights and a pizza place and a neighbor who waves when he sees me and doesn't stare. It wasn't a heroic exit. It was a slow unbuttoning of a life. We sold the cabin to someone who liked the quiet and cheaper things than we understood. Maybe they'll be fine. Maybe they'll notice the small things and not let them grow. The last time I drove down that gravel road I saw the trailer and there were people on the porch, not watching the way we had been watched but just sitting, talking and laughing like people. I stopped the truck and waited for a moment and then drove on. The hollow looked the same: trees, creek, that small blue of the ridges. The world keeps being itself. You go on learning the rules for how you sleep, and how you lock things up, and how you make sure your doors are bolts and not just words. My car died in the middle of a curve, right where the road cuts a hairpin and everything on the other side of the guardrail drops away into trees. It wasn't dramatic, no explosion or smoke, nothing Hollywood, just the engine went soft and the little warning light blinked like it was embarrassed it had to tell me. It was late afternoon, the light in the holler was thin and yellow, and I was alone. My phone said no service in small black letters that I could have sworn waited until I needed it to be cruel. I had been heading home to visit my sister for the weekend, but I took the long way because I like the mountains and I like the curves and I like thinking I'm tough on back roads. That was stupid. The city idea of being tough does not apply when you are halfway up a mountain and your car sounds like it has given up. I coasted as far as I could, pulled over on a small shoulder, and killed the engine. The road had those little gravel shoulders that were only wide enough for a flat tire and a prayer. The guardrail leaned over the drop like a tired arm rail. The trees were close. The sound of the creek far below was a constant, low breath. I put on my hazard lights because that is what the handbook says to do and stood for a long time like someone waiting for a friend who never comes. I checked my jacket for a flashlight. I checked the glove box for paperwork. I tried the ignition again like kindness might coax it into life. The light blinked. The key turned and the car made a small tired noise, and that was it. I thought about walking down to the next turnout and maybe there would be a house or a truck, but the turnoff for the county road was miles down, and the sky was already shading toward night. There had been a cluster of flyers tacked to the telephone pole at the last turnout. Lost dog and fish FRY Saturday 4 p.m. and a missing persons poster, all curling in Water Street. I hadn't stopped to read the missing flyer. The wind had scrubbed at the edges. I told myself I would go back and call when I had bars. It was such a small, ordinary plan, like plans you make when nothing is wrong. I tried calling for roadside service and all I got was that same small no service. I sent a text and watched it sit with a gray clock beside it. I felt stupid for being there. I had that tight little hollow in my chest that says you're alone and you messed up. A pickup truck came down the curve slow enough that I had time to think about waving and then decided to hold my hand up instead. The truck was an older Ford, big cab, rust on the edges, faded deep red. The kind of truck the mountains have a lot of. It slowed to a stop a little past me, pulled onto the shoulder, and the driver leaned across to open the passenger door from his side. He had the sort of face that looked like the mountains, straight and worn in the color of weather. He waved like it was no bother. "You need a hand," he said. "Relief has a taste like pennies." I said yes. I told him my car had died, my phone had no signal. He gave me that quiet practical nod people do when they see someone in trouble and are deciding how much trouble they want to take on. He introduced himself as Frank, middle-aged, a little chubby, with those hands that had a thick skin across the knuckles. He smelled like cigarettes and pine sap and some cheap cologne that tries to read as one of those men's grooming products. He offered me a ride down to the next town, the one with a diner and a gas station where I could at least charge my phone. I said I could wait for roadside, but when he shrugged like he did not mind, he said, "You look like you're freezing. Come with me. I'll take you." His truck was ordinary on the inside, vinyl seats, a couple of tools in the back, a plastic cup with old coffee in the cup holder. When I climbed in, the seat smelled like someone had been sleeping there, a little damp, a little like someone had left a jacket. In the rear view I noticed a woman's purse tossed in the corner of the truck bed. It looked fresh, not weathered. It was leather, red, the kind of purse you see in store windows. There was a perfume smell even through the open window and a stray hair tie tangled on the strap. It looked like it did not belong there. I squinted at it and asked, casual, "Is that yours?" He laughed too easily. "Nah. That's Jenny's," he said, like that explained everything. "She left it out there last time we came through to check a fence. Folks around here leave things." "Jenny?" I said, and the name sounded small in the truck. Does she live around here?" He nodded, like the question was obvious. "Up the ridge. She's family. She came through sometimes." He asked me where I was headed. I told him the town at the bottom of the valley. He said he'd drop me there, no problem. We pulled away, getting back on the narrow road, the truck hugging the center line like a blunt thing on a thin knife. At first he was easy company, small talk about the weather, about the county fair, about where I was from. He had that way of talking where he kept his voice low, like he was telling you a secret and not shouting into the wind. He asked what I did for work, if I was visiting, and where my sister lived. I answered like I was answering a dinner guest, short, tidy. I kept glancing up at that red purse in the rear view and telling myself not to. The mind isn't respectful of plans like that. A mile or so in, he started asking a different kind of question. "Does anyone know you're out here alone?" he asked, casual, shifting his eyes to the road but almost like he expected me to say no. I said yes, my sister should be expecting me. He said, "Anyone know your car's broken? Anyone know where you were headed?" His voice didn't change much, but the questions felt like hooks. I told him my sister didn't call because she knew I liked the long way. He was quiet for a minute and then asked, "Do you live alone? Boyfriend? Husband?" He said it like it was an inventory. That line of questions made something cold press behind my ribs. It was that old real world that you can feel in your gut, people asking about where you sleep, who you sleep with, who would notice you missing. He kept asking as if each answer gave him a picture of how easy I'd be to collect, if I would be noticed, how much alarm someone would raise. It was small details he was fishing for, names, phone numbers, if my sister would notice, if my car had a tracking app. He asked, "You got anyone who would come looking if you didn't show up tonight?" I said my sister would be worried after a while. He smiled like that was an answer he'd expected and then asked, "How long?" "A few hours." "Or the next day?" I tried to keep the talk light and said, "Probably a few hours." She knows I'm slow with the coffee. He nodded again and kept driving. He asked if I had called anyone. I said I had and that cell reception had gone. He said the word reception like it was an old savage joke. We drove a while longer. The truck felt like a small, rolling room, the radio off, the engine a soft thrum. The sky was getting dimmer. The trees boxed us in. I couldn't tell if he was trying to be nice or if he was sizing up a situation. People suss each other out in microseconds, and sometimes that reveals nothing and sometimes that reveals everything. At one point I noticed his hands on the wheel, old scars on the calluses, a ring of grease under one thumbnail. When he reached to change gears, his fingers brushed the flashlight in the console and I thought, for a ridiculous second, of the way people keep things handy. I was being paranoid, I told myself. He had been kind, he'd stopped. There was a moment where relief wanted to turn into being thankful. I almost believed it. Then we passed a turnout that had a cluster of cars parked near a trailhead and a bunch of people unloading gear. They were bright and loud and ordinary. I said, "Oh, can you drop me there? I'll wait until the next county bus or someone will come." He kept going. "You're taking me to town, remember?" he said. He didn't sound like he was arguing, just confirming. I thought I started. "There's a lot of people there. I could call from the ranger station. They usually have a line." He shook his head. "They're closed. Weekends they close early. I'll take you to town. Trust me." The "trust me" sat wrong on his lips. We went through another curve and the road narrowed. The drop on one side was steeper, the trees thicker, the light gone to a gray wash. My phone still had no bars. My mouth felt dry and there was a small buzzing where my knee met the console. He started asking the same questions again. "You sure no one's coming? No boyfriend? No guy who checks in on you?" It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was like he was cataloging the ease of my disappearance. I noticed him glance at the truck bed in the rear view and then at me. It occurred to me, in a quiet stupid logic, What if the purse belonged to someone who'd last been seen in this area? What if the purse in the back had just been thrown in there? The thought was an animal in the dark. It made my limbs prick. I asked him, "Who's Jenny?" Does she? My voice caught on the word live. Does she have family? Where does she go? He said she lived up the ridge and that they had been up all day stringing fence. He said she came down ahead of me and left it. She'll come get it when she remembers. He shrugged like the answer was as good as any. We passed a mailbox with a crooked flag that had been bent earlier, a pair of boots on a porch, a little child's bike on its side with leaves in the spokes. The road felt like a narrow throat and the sky above a lid. The questions kept coming and I kept answering because what else was there to do? I thought of the missing person poster I'd seen at the turnout and tried to make a map in my head. I imagined him dropping me and driving back up to his life. I imagined his hands doing ordinary things. I imagined them doing other sorts of things. None of those maps made me feel any more safe. At some point his tone shifted. He stopped asking and started telling. He told me what people do up there, in the holler, the kind of men who pretended to be nice and then thought it was funny. He told me about a woman who'd come through in a rental car and had run off to the city. He said it like it was a parable about how people are careless. You can't just leave your stuff, he said. People are looking. I kept my eyes on whatever the road showed me and didn't look too often into the rear view. But I would glance, and each time the red purse looked different, sometimes clean, sometimes with a smear on one side that might have been mud or lipstick. Once it looked like something inside had shifted, like a corner of a flyer or a small piece of paper poking out. My stomach did a small turn. He slowed for a narrow bridge and then pulled into a tiny pullout on the other side. There was no building, just a flat stretch and a little wooden bench that someone had left there like a memory. He killed the engine. I thought maybe he stopped so I could get out and duck into the trees to call, but the truck's engine was off and the air smelled like wet leaves and cigarettes. He turned and looked at me with an expression that made my shoulders want to rise. "Do you want me to wait while you call?" he asked. I fumbled for my phone, trying it like a ritual. No service. I said, "Maybe if it's not too much trouble, could you just give me the number for the garage? I'll remember the name." He took his time to give me a number. He pronounced it slowly like someone teaching a child. When he finished he said, "You know, sometimes people are out here and nobody knows. Folks get lost. Folks get into trouble." His voice didn't change. He wasn't a storyteller, he was someone saying facts. We got back on the road and I tried to think of small things to say so I wouldn't sound frightened. I asked about his truck, asked how long he'd lived in the county. He answered in little pieces. He asked about my work. I told him my job in a library. He made a small joke about people who read being easy to follow. Almost harmless if it had been anyone else. We passed a small cluster of blinking lights that could have been a house or could have been nothing. The truck slowed and then didn't stop. He turned onto a smaller road, and suddenly we were on a stretch I didn't recognize. The map in my head was rearranging itself wrong. He said he knew a shortcut to the diner where I wanted to go, and that sometimes the road with the lights was closed. He had that way of saying it like the world was a place you take shortcuts through to save time. My throat felt full. I asked him, "Are you sure we're headed the right way?" He smiled a little, not cruel but too easy. "Trust me," he said. When the road got rougher and the dusk thickened into that gray that kills detail, I asked him to pull over at a little truck stop I remembered from when I'd driven this route before. A pump, a light, maybe someone at the counter. He kept driving. "There's not much up here," he said. "It'll be fine." He said it like a vow. I looked at the purse again. I felt stupid for being the sort of person who noticed small things. It was so obvious. I wanted to say so many things that would change the map of our drive. Stop the truck, let me out, show me your ID, let me call my sister. I could feel each one of those things like options with a weight and a cost. My mouth had learned to stilt and say small things first. At one point he glanced into the mirror, saw me looking at the purse, and his face closed the tiniest bit. He asked, "Why you keep staring at that thing?" Without thinking, I said, "It looks new." "Did you buy it?" He snorted and said something about how people bring things and forget them. There was a short knife of defensiveness in his voice. Then he asked me, more plainly than before, "Does your sister know where you are right now? Does she check in? Is there anyone who'd notice if you were gone?" I lied then. I said my sister had to go to work early tomorrow and that she would call right away if I didn't show up. I told him I'd probably get home before she worried. He listened the way people do when they're waiting for you to tell them when you're vulnerable. He said nothing. It was getting close to dark when we came to a narrow place where the trees opened and there was a little run of gravel and a single building, 2 pumps, scuffed metal, a diner that looked like it had been built in a different decade. A light burned behind the counter and a radio hummed. I realized we were close enough to people that I might get help. My relief was dirty and half hopeful. "Can we stop there?" I said, sharper than I'd meant. He slowed and pulled up at the pump, but he turned the truck so he was blocking most of the pumps. We were the only car. The lights seemed to glare brighter against his silhouette. He killed the engine but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he just looked at me, and that look was not the look of a man offering help. "I can grab you a charger," he said. "You might want to plug your phone in before we go on." I blinked. The small plan I had run in, find a person, get the number for a tow, swiveled into place. I told him to go in and buy a soda, and I'd run in to use the phone. He shook his head. "I'll go in," he said. "You sit tight." He got out, and I watched him cross the slick pavement. He didn't go to the door. He walked to the pump and began messing with the nozzle like he was doing nothing. I thought that was odd, but told myself he was just getting gas. I unbuckled and said, "I'm coming with you." He didn't look right at me as he said, "You stay here. I'll be right back." Something in my chest gave a small hard turn. I eased the handle and climbed out, making sure to keep my phone in my hand. I walked toward the door slow and like a person trying not to alarm someone. He didn't come behind me. He walked toward the pump and then toward the back of the lot where a narrow track disappeared into trees. There was a footpath and a pile of pallets, and the shadow looked wrong in the sentry light. I went in the diner because the idea of a person with a counter and coffee and a radio felt like a salvage right out of a bad story. The bell on the door snapped, and the woman behind the counter was older, hair in a towel, hands painted in flour. She looked up at me and didn't ask who I was. She just said, "You look like you need something hot." I blinked, and then I said, "My car broke down," and I told her quickly about the truck and about him, that he'd offered to take me to town but that I wanted to call a tow. I told the story like someone who was testing how I'd sound when I needed a person to know. She nodded and grabbed the phone on the counter like she'd been waiting for that precise moment. She dialed the county garage and then, without listening, she said, "You better tell the man to get going. I don't like a truck blocking the pumps." I swallowed and slipped back outside because I couldn't stand being in a room full of normal when my bones were not. I saw the truck at the pumps. He had the truck door open and was leaning into the bed. He bent down and reached for something. For a second he was bent over and I could see the red of that purse in the bed. Then he straightened and there was a woman standing at the edge of the tree line, thin, pale, hair masked with a bandana. I didn't even know she had been there, which is the worst part. She was not moving like a person at rest. She was standing like a puppet someone had just let go of. I took a quick step back and almost knocked into a man who had come out of the diner with a coffee. He watched me, and in the corner of his eye he watched the truck. The man at the pump saw us and turned. Our eyes met and something like a string snapped. "Hey!" I called. The man's head jerks, and in that flash his face lost any neutral shape it had. He reached into his pocket, and the way he handled it, too smooth, too practiced, made my insides go cold. The woman at the tree line didn't move. I don't know if she was held or if she had gone there on her own. I only know, later, that she had been sitting in the truck when I climbed in, and that she had a handful of bruises at her wrists, and that the purse in the bed had a lipstick stain and a little key with a heart charm on it that matched a missing persons flyer I'd seen at the turnout. The man came toward us. Up close, when he moved, something angular in his shoulders read his threat. He said, "Everything okay?" like a man who had rehearsed. The diner man, a stranger who had been washing his hands, stood a step between us. He didn't ask questions. He didn't take sides. He just said, "Ma'am, get in here. Get in now." I moved like my body had been handed a map. The stranger grabbed my elbow and pulled me inside. The man at the pumps cursed and moved toward us. He was close enough to see his boots were caked with mud that matched the smear on our threshold earlier. He kept looking at the purse in the bed as if he expected it to be gone. The diner woman slammed the phone down and got on the line with someone else, someone with a badge name, but I didn't hear it clearly. There was clatter and the sound of a truck driving off. The man at the pump turned his head and looked back at the diner as if measuring advantage. He slammed the nozzle back and fumbled with his keys, muttering low. For a while it seemed like a stalemate. I sat at a booth and breathed like someone who'd run a race they didn't remember starting. The deputy came, blue lights in the distance, 2 cruisers, the sound like a train but soft and immediate. They interviewed us, took statements, took my photos of the purse and the prints in the dirt I'd snapped with my phone before I climbed into the truck. The woman who'd been at the tree line was taken to the hospital by the deputies. She had a name and numbers and bruises and a small, haunted look. She didn't talk much that night. Later I learned that the purse had been reported missing by someone who'd parked at the turnout earlier. The same woman was on one of those crackly community posts about a woman who had been seen getting into a truck. They found the man a few hours later at a motel off the highway. His room had smoke curling from a sink, and there were 3 phones on the nightstand. They asked him questions. He said he'd been doing his own work, checking fences, and that there had been confusion. The deputies didn't like his answers. They booked him on multiple counts related to kidnapping and theft. I didn't go to the station that night. The diner man drove me to my sister's in town. I sat in the passenger seat in a quiet, like someone who had survived a storm and was noticing the sound of rain on the roof anew. Afterward, the parts of it that weren't dramatic were the ones that hurt. The way he had asked about who would notice me, like he was making a chart. The way the purse had sat in the bed like an accusation. The smell of cheap cologne in his truck. The silence in the tree line where she had stood. The deputy's voice talking about evidence and patterns and how these things sometimes came in pairs, open doors, and a man who liked to know if someone would notice. I slept badly for a while. I kept checking my phone like a dog checks the door. Little things that had been ordinary before turned into triggers. A pair of headlights behind me on a winding road, an older truck with a bed full of tools, the sound of someone saying, "Trust me." My sister stayed with me for a week. I filed an official statement. I gave my photos to the deputies. They took my glove box and my receipts. They said they pursued charges, and they did, and the prosecutor told me later there was a string of similar reports, women who had been singled out for rides, pickups that skirted the edges of town where cell signal was poor, and purses tumbled in truck beds like proof. There is a small relief that came that day. People who aren't you do show up sometimes. The diner man who made a step into the gap and did a simple right thing. The deputies who came with lights and paper. the ambulance that took a woman who had been out of help. That ordinary, human help was more dangerous in its absence than any of the things that had happened before. I still drive that road sometimes, but I don't take the long way on foggy afternoons. I keep my phone charged and my sister knows the name of the county line I cross. I keep a small flashlight and I try not to be the sort of person who thinks being nice will always be safe. I think, too, about the woman who had been in the back of that truck, about what she had been doing and what stopped her from being where she was supposed to be, and I think about how easily a car door clicks and a map of someone's life can change. I think about the purse in the bed like a symbol, but offering no explanation, only the proof of presence. You learn to watch the small things after the night, the smell of perfume when no one is around, the way someone's laugh locates them, the way a hand lingers on the steering wheel. You don't want to live by fear, but you can't pretend you didn't learn something about how people look for chances. The mountain doesn't change because of one evening. It stays the same with its colors and its drops. But my map has marks on it now. Turn out at mile 7, the diner with a bell, a pickup that stopped, but the marks are for a different kind of travel. They say, go, but go careful.